So picture this. You're walking through a city. It's not the biggest city on the planet, but it's a sizable city. You look up, there's surrounded by skyscrapers. You look up, you can't even see the top of some of them. Street is littered with garbage, not in an overflowing sort of plague-ridden way, but you can tell it's not the number one priority. You're visually assaulted with tons of extremely bright advertisements. They seem to weaponize it. They get brighter every few years. The streets are packed with people who are all just stuck to their electronic devices connected to this giant global network, right? Cars drive along right beside you, feet sometimes inches away from you. They don't make that engine sound of the past, right? They make this whoo, like electronic whirring sound, right? You walk for 5-10 minutes, no one will even look you in the eye, right? You're assaulted with all sorts of different smells, ranging from what smells like burning and chemicals to just, the stench of humanity suffering. Not to be too melodramatic, there's a handful of faceless megacorporations that basically control the majority of the wealth, that treat these human beings who you're walking up and down the street with as disposable and expendable. Yet, to serve their corporate overlords, they, that's the only way to survive, right? This is like the typical world building for your normal cyberpunk dystopian novel. And the thing, of course, is that what I'm describing is just real life, which is why I think cyberpunk as a genre is very tired. We live in the future, and the reason that we don't think we live in the future is because the aesthetics of our future look the way that they do. If we were, transported into a parallel dimension where visual aesthetics of our technology, cars, architecture, and most importantly, personal electronics, were at the same level as far as like ability, but just looked different, we would say, holy shit, that's the future. When in reality, they could be 5 years behind us, right? But it looks like it's the future because it looks different. We don't think that we live in the future because the things look like how they look. And so to us, that's just life. But this is the thing, right? Like the whole corporate overlord type thing where, the entire world's economy is controlled by a handful of these faceless corporations that don't even value human beings. That's just real life. And the media just brainwashes people into not noticing or not even caring because they don't have enough energy to give a shit because they're just so overworked and so meaningless as human beings. That's just real life. I could do this for an hour. This is the thing, is in the 80s when everyone was fucking doing coke and thought that the world was the greatest place ever, then yeah, I can see why that vision was so incredible and life-changing to a lot of people, right? Neuromancer, specifically. There's some others, but this is the thing, is in current year, we live in the future, and the reason we don't is because it doesn't look like it. When you go on Facebook, there isn't like a 3D light grid with like vaporwave mountains on either side, but if there was, that would be it, right? Because it functions the same as like cyberspace in your Neuromancer or your Snow Crash, all these seminal novels. I hope I'm using that word right. But visually it looks not like the future because we live in it, and so it can't be the future because the future isn't here yet because the future's in the future, right? Duh. So whatever we're experiencing now, that's not the future, not yet. Even though now we have cars, the more I walk around a city, the more the cars just go woo instead of making engine noises. Like, that's fucking crazy, man. And I get they're just electric cars, right? But the thing is, it's how you look at it. And that's kind of my point, is that a lot of sci-fi doesn't exist anymore to be like, what if technology was at this level? Some do, but the level has to be pretty fucking high because we are kind of immersed in technology right now. It's not inside of us yet for most people, but it won't be long. But the thing is, the function of sci-fi is and has always been to shine new light on the current situation. Like The Expanse is a great example. It is a not subtle, well, okay, it's multifaceted, but one aspect of it is a very not subtle view of racism and bigotry. But it's not about their actual race, the color of their skin. It's from where they're from, because there's belters who grew up not on planets, and so they're lankier, they're spindlier, they don't have a lot of meat on them because, they grew up in like 0.3 gravity or like maybe 0.5 gravity, but rarely they set foot on a planet. And so it's really difficult for them to survive on a planet because that fucks with bone density and all sorts of things. So the inner planets, Earth and Mars and kind of the moon, they've all got different cultures, and these cultures are different, but more importantly, they're super fucking racist towards belters. And the way that plays out is such a cutting and apparent correlation to current racism. It should be obvious to anyone reading that, but it isn't. It's just a book about how racism bad, because that's not a book, that's just a thing. Due to living in what is effectively space and being cut off from what is effectively the rest of humanity in the early books, the belters develop their own culture. They have specific mentality, they have their own language, they have their own way of doing things, which isn't taken seriously by the rest of the inner planets, which leads to a lot of conflict. It's not as black and white as, oh, you guys are lanky, we don't like you. No, it's how their cultures are different. Like I said, they have their own language, and they're naturally more distrusting of these big sort of authoritarian figures, as they should be, because of their history in the books. But it's also things like they will obsessively double and triple check everything. There has to be routine and regiment, because when you live in a space station or in a spaceship, that's the difference between life and death. Triple checking and being obsessive, because the ones who didn't are dead now, and that just doesn't exist in the inner planets. And this drives a lot of conflict. It's not as stupid as they look different, we don't like them. It's a cultural thing. They're not taken seriously, and I think that that's really good. I don't know what you call it. Like, it's not necessarily satire, but sort of, it's a political reflection of a lot of things that happen in current times. The function of sci-fi writing isn't primarily to be futuristic, unless that's the whole thing, is just like, what if future? But for most of them that have, plots and character development and all of these sort of things, that's what you're gonna find if you dig into it, is it's just a reskin of where we're already living. And a lot of the times they will push the technology forward, sometimes not even that far forward, sometimes like 15 years forward maybe, but that's not even critical for a lot of them. Once you have like global near instant communication, that's where a lot of them can stop. And the only thing that makes it more futuristic is that it's like implanted, right? So you just call it up with your little like shit inside of your eye or in your brain or whatever. But even if it was taking place on cell phones, and they don't call them cell phones, right? They'll call them a ton of different things. They'll call them terminals, or they'll call them all sorts of different things. It depends on the world building. But the point is that it's not a cell phone. Even though it's functionally identical and they communicate with them still, they serve the purpose of a cell phone, because a world without that instant global communication, that would be alien, right? Then it wouldn't feel like sci-fi. But all they have to do is take the concept of a cell phone, add literally nothing, change the name of it, all the functions can be the same, right? Like in the Expanse universe, they're hundreds of years into the future, but what are they communicating with? Text and video. And conference calls when they can, except when light speed fucks with it, so it's not going to be instant, right? Like, it's not like it's beaming telepathy. It's the same shit that we have now, because all it is just addressing issues that we have now with a different reskin. And that's what good sci-fi needs to be, not needs to be, but that's what good sci-fi is. And you have your super technical hard sci-fi where the whole point of it is pushing towards technology and like, here's a future with this specific advanced technology, and that's cool. It's better if you can work characters and a plot into it, and I feel like the problem with a lot of those books is that they don't. And so it's like, oh, why is this pop sci-fi so much more popular? Like, that's why, because they got memorable characters and a good, you know, book-to-book story arc, and then a massive overarching story, and that's more important. But this is why I do not like cyberpunk, because you can look through the world, like, you can look at the world in a lot of ways, and I don't think it's just insane pessimism. Maybe that has something to do with it. But there are better, more productive, more interesting, and more creative ways to look at the world. Better lenses exist now. And I think that cyberpunk is a very tired genre because it doesn't take any imagination. I think it's very easy to see the world through that lens. I don't think you need to change anything. As long as you realize in your brain, hey, we live in the future, instead of waiting for the future to come, that's really all it takes. There's like genres now that are pushing in different ways. And I mean, they were in the 80s too. Like Ian M. Banks' Culture is this amazing utopia, post-scarcity, post-labor. You can just do whatever the hell you want, right? And that's a pretty radical interpretation of the future, even at the same time cyberpunk was a thing in the 80s. But now we got shit like cloud punk, or not cloud punk, that's a game. Solar punk is what I'm thinking of. This idea that I've talked about this, right, when I was talking about the new direction for the design abstract. Okay, so here's the context of that. So cloud punk is this idea that technology advances the same degree that it would have in cyberpunk, except it's used in a way where we're not destroying the environment. And so there's this focus on community and on homegrown, homemade, non-production line goods, right? Things that are locally made or specially made for people around you. And this emphasis on living in environments that aren't super detrimental to the earth and to our environment, and just living in a way that isn't. But it can be just as cool and just as interesting. I dare say it's harder to apply to real life just because those type of living arrangements in real life are a lot more difficult. Just the way the structure is, the way society man is. For example, public transit, good, yes. I live in a town of like 1,000 people. We have one traffic light. We have no grocery store. There's no public transit to speak of. You know, if I wanted to walk to the nearest bus stop, it would take me 2 hours at a good pace, because I would be walking 14-ish kilometers. That is not an option for me. It just isn't. And I'm not the only one, especially in North America. The infrastructure there, there's so much land to cover. If you live in a small town, you simply just buy a car. And electric cars are an option. In Canada, it's like, the range isn't super great, and the winter is really hard on the batteries. But it is a possibility. However, it's not super easy either. You have to shell out a pretty decent amount of money, and it's a lot easier to just like throw a couple thousand into like a beater if you just need a car. Like cheap electric cars aren't there yet, at least as far as I know. This is the thing. I'm hypocritical because I drive a giant fucking dystopian SUV. And I bought that before I started thinking about this stuff, unfortunately. And I like my space, and I'm a bigger guy, so I like having all of that space. But still, it would have been nice if I kind of learned all this shit about myself and about the world before. But it is what it is. And a vehicle is necessary, and you're just going to find like the vast majority of them are still gasoline powered, unless you live in town and you're just kind of driving around in town. I think it's more practical. Anyway, this isn't about electric vehicles specifically. It's about science fiction and how, barring like super technical hard sci-fi about technology, good sci-fi is just retelling what already is happening, shining new light on it, a reskin, and that's why cyberpunk I think really falls flat. And I felt this way before the game came out too, which I haven't played. It's just that kind of exposed a lot of normies to it. But I felt that way before that because the world was in a very similar state before cyberpunk came out. When you think about these few faceless massive corporations that just own so much wealth in the world, and they just treat human beings like they're expendable, which is what it's like in Neuromancer. And just the technology there, the only difference, the only stuff that they have that we don't have is like the neuro implant shit, because like people are scared of that now, and that's telling about a world where the ends justify the means, and we're not there yet, but we will be. We're just going to do it safer. But like all of the technology, all of the societal things, even the atmosphere, the setting, that's all just perspective. Like where do they live in? Like, is it Chiba City? I forget which one that is. Doesn't matter. What they're describing, the sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't see how that isn't real life. That city, whatever city that is, I can't think of the name of. It's just a city. It's just a city that exists now. You have drug addicts in cities, or you know that, right? Those exist. You don't have to. It's not fiction. Like, yeah, I don't know. Just a little perspective on sci-fi. We live in the future. Don't forget that.